I'm going to show you today how to handle a contingency matter in LeanLaw. The sample here is going to be a personal injury matter. I have a client named Frederick Trent, and we're in litigation against State Farm. So I've already in LeanLaw used this plus function to create the client and the matter. So that's how we got to this place. And when we land into our matter, we see the general tab where I can add a practice area or notes. Under fixed fees, I've already set this up as a contingency matter. Now remember, a contingency fee in terms of the legal fees is just a flat rate. We just don't know what the flat rate is. So I've set the amount to $1 and I'll adjust that once we actually settle. Um, I'm going to walk you through the process of handling expenses. Now, LeanLaw has a slew of different ways to track time associated with a contingency matter. I'm not going to cover it because most folks, that's not important, and we have other videos. So I'm going to shift gears and say that we've engaged the client, and we're going about our processes of supporting that client, and we have a few expenses. And I'm going to show you two different ways expenses can be added for this matter. The first is if we're going to expend dollars on behalf of the firm and recoup those in the form of an invoice. And I'm just going to go to expenses and I'm going to add an expense. So again, these are monies that I've put out and pick my client Trent. It knows the matter. Let's just say I did some copying or some other fees and I put my $50 in there and hit save. And that expense is ready and staged so that once I get the settlement, I can add that to my fees for reimbursement. The second and more common one is those in QuickBooks. So in QuickBooks, I can add an expense by saying a bill. So we'll say this is a medical bill. And I use the plus function for a bill. And I stage this, and we'll say it's a medical vendor. Now, the most important thing is that I want to associate it initially with a liability account for the client. Now, this sounds a little confusing, but I'm going to take a step back and show you that we created under the chart of accounts, LeanLaw did this in an automated way, a specific ledger, the liability side. This is where the trust funds will be deposited to manage that expense. So as long as I make sure that I cite that liability side, when I go to pay out those invoices after settlement, we'll properly account for the liability um, going up and down based on the income. So back to bill, I cite the liability, medical expense. I'm going to save this and memorize from a previous one. Versus State Farm, and it was $1,200. And I can even cite the client, Trent. So that bill is going to be paid out once the settlement happens, not necessarily we do something before. If I ever wanted to, so now I've shown you how to do an expense in LeanLaw. If it's something that we've expended, or we can do it in QuickBooks, we can add those bills in the normal bill function. We just want to make sure that that Trent register is cited in the account. Now let's review the settlement piece of it. And my settlement, my fee is going to be 30% of what we're going to receive, which is $100,000. So I get a check from State Farm and I say deposit to trust. Now I've established the trust account for Frederick Trent. I've received $100,000. Whoops. We'll say I got it today. The source was State Farm Insurance, and it was settlement. And we cite this information because that will get passed over to QuickBooks. So immediately this drops me back into my trust account, and now I can go into Trent and see that Trent Frederick has the money. Now it says 98,800 because it's counting for the $1,200 that we've already put in. So if I head back over to the register and have a look, you'll see that LeanLaw has done that deposit. It's increased the asset, I owe the trust account, and increased the liability. So the 9,800 is that we've already accounted for the $1,200. We haven't paid that bill yet, but we essentially staged it against the liability. Now, I want to actually pay myself. That's the next step. And you could see how we'd add more bills and whatnot. So I head back to LeanLaw and I go back into my matter and search for Trent, the last name of the client. And now I know the amount of my fixed fee. So I head to the fixed fee tab. And again, I'm in matters and the client, Frederick Trent and State Farm. And I'll just go in and edit this. And now I know that my fee is 30% of $100,000, which is $30,000. And I'm going to say save fixed fee. So that's the amount. I want to now produce an invoice. The reason I want to produce an invoice is because it creates the accounts receivable, it memorializes the services into a document so I can clearly articulate that to the client, and it also allows me to accommodate for that one expense that I incurred and wanted to bring back to the client. So I head to my billing tab and I can search for Trent. There's the fee, so I have $30,050, and I'm going to click that into a draft. Once in drafts, I could edit this, but for our purposes, I'm going to just send it directly to QuickBooks. By editing, I mean I can open it up and I can make any changes I need to do. We're going to save, and I'm going to submit that to QuickBooks. What that means is I'm have frozen in LeanLaw so that all of the entries are only editable through the draft invoice, but it's now been delivered to QuickBooks where it's a live invoice in QuickBooks. So there's that $30,000. Now I want to pay myself. I want to write a check or move funds from my trust account to my personal operating account because I've memorialized those services into an invoice. And you'll notice now under Trent, we'll see that we have a $30,000 receivable. So here's the 30,000. That's an actual live receivable. It's in the form of an invoice in QuickBooks. I can show it to you right here. There's that invoice right there. So what I'm going to do now is actually pay this invoice off. And so we know it's invoice 1892. It was for $30,050. I'm going to record a payment. So that leaves a balance of $68,750 in the trust account and allows me to go in and actually pay myself. So I can move the actual money, whether I do it by check or by transfer. The last thing I want to do in QuickBooks is I want to actually write a check to pay that bill. Remember, I had the $1,200 check. So I'm just going to go into the pay bill function. I've got my medical vendor. I want to make sure I select the IELTA bank and I say save and close. So if I go look at Trent's register, I can see that I owe the client the ending balance. Let me refresh this. I owe the client the $68,000 in a settlement check. And this is the last piece. So I just say produce a check. I'm going to check the trust balance in LeanLaw to make sure it's accurate. And it is $68,750. So I'll go into QuickBooks, write the check to Trent. We know the liability account. We can get rid of that and say settlement to client, and it was 68,000, and I save and close. So now we have a zero balance, and I can easily go back to LeanLaw, and you'll see that I refresh this page. I'll have a zero balance as well, and I could produce that physical check, and I can easily just create a trust report for the client. So I would just simply deliver to the client a printout of this report, which shows all the transactional activity. You can see we had a medical expense, payment of invoice, settlement to the client, and the international funds. And of course, the dates are all today, so those dates would look more sequential. I could also easily go back and get the paid invoice and make that as part of my documentation to the client. So I could easily print that invoice and close and print. So, and you can see that we have that all that detailed to the client, and that summarizes it. So in QuickBooks, LeanLaw has facilitated all of the money in and money out, both expenses directly to a vendor, my payment for legal services and expenses I've incurred, and of course the settlement back to the client. And all of that has been properly documented in the memo, so it's there for historical purposes. So that's LeanLaw's tracking the trust account relative to a contingency matter.